You guys are amazing. I'm so lucky to have one of the best communities on YouTube. I've always had a goal hitting 1,000 likes on a vid, but you guys smashed it on one of the vids and got it to 2,000 likes. Thanks so much. Let's try and get a high score on this video. Please smash that like button. I know you guys can. It's free and it means the world to me. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. This is my first time getting this off my chest, so here it goes. Trust me, you're not gonna believe this one. I still can't get the image out of my head. It was just a random moment like any other, but it flipped my whole world upside down. I had been dating Tina for about 6 months. At first, everything seemed perfect. She was funny, sweet, and we had this insane chemistry that made it feel like we'd known each other for years. I was completely hooked. We spent weekends together, talked all the time, and honestly, I thought this could be something serious. For me, at least it was. But then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. We were sitting on the couch watching some dumb movie when her phone buzzed. She was sitting across from me, so it wasn't like I was intentionally snooping. But when she quickly picked up the phone and looked at the screen, I couldn't help but notice the name on the message. It was from someone called Hubby. That wasn't the weird part. The weird part was the message itself. Kids missing you. Now, in any normal relationship, that wouldn't raise any red flags. But with Tina, it did. I didn't know what to think. The whole thing just didn't sit right. I didn't know if Hubby was her friend's husband or someone she worked with, but my gut told me to be cautious. It felt like I had just caught a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't say anything at first. I just let it slide, but the message kept gnawing at me. For the next couple of days, I tried to ignore it, but every time I was with her, I couldn't stop thinking about that text. Eventually, I gave in and decided to bring it up. I figured maybe I was overreacting. I told myself, there's got to be a reasonable explanation. But when I confronted her, that's when everything started to fall apart. Tina went pale, her face dropped, and I could see the panic in her eyes. She started fidgeting with her hands, not looking at me. I didn't need to hear the words. I could tell she wasn't going to deny it. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking, and finally admitted it. The thing was, Tina was married. She had 2 kids, a whole family. This wasn't just some casual relationship for her. This was something much more twisted. She told me that she had been married for years, but her husband had been distant lately. She said they were going through a rough patch, and that's why she turned to me. I didn't even know what to say. My brain was racing. How had I not seen this coming? How did she pull this off for so long? She begged me not to tell her husband. She said that if I told him, it would ruin everything. I could tell she was genuinely upset, but at the same time, I didn't know how to feel. I was hurt, confused, and disgusted. She had lied to me for 6 months, and not just about little things. She had lied about something huge. After she left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me, and I was just left in the rubble. I wanted to forget everything and move on, but I couldn't. The thought of this man, her husband, not knowing what was going on behind his back, it didn't sit right with me. I was about to just let this go. I thought about it for hours. I couldn't stand the idea of being a part of something so deceitful. I didn't care what Tina had said about not telling him. I knew I couldn't keep this secret. He deserved to know the truth. I spent the next few days trying to track him down. I went through her social media looking for any clue that would lead me to him. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, if I had to get answers. I finally found him. He wasn't hard to find, considering he had his own online presence. A few clicks, and there he was, a profile picture of a guy who looked just like any other dad you'd see at a weekend barbecue. It wasn't hard to figure out where he worked, either. I found his office number, and my heart raced as I picked up the phone to call him. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it was like everything built up to this moment, and I couldn't back out now. The conversation was awkward, to say the least. I told him what had been happening about Tina and me, how she had been lying and seeing me behind his back. I expected him to freak out or to call me a liar, but he didn't. It was like I was talking to a wall. At first, he didn't say much. Then I heard him sigh deeply, and I knew this wasn't the first time he'd suspected something. I felt terrible for him. I mean, I didn't know him personally, but just imagining the heartbreak he must have been going through was crushing. He thanked me for telling him the truth, and that was it. We hung up. I didn't hear from Tina again for a while. I blocked her on everything, but I knew things weren't over. Part of me felt guilty for blowing her life up, but the other part of me knew I did the right thing. I couldn't live with the lie. A few weeks later, I found out that Tina's husband had confronted her. They were getting a divorce, and she had lost everything. The kids, the house, everything. Part of me felt bad, but the other part of me just felt like I was witnessing a train wreck. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I don't know what Tina's doing now, or if she's even with someone else. All I know is that after 6 months of thinking everything was great, I had been living a lie, and I was the one who had to deal with the fallout. It's been months, and I still can't believe how everything played out. It's crazy to think that someone I was so close to could lie so easily, manipulate everything to her advantage. And now I'm left with nothing but a messed up story to tell. A story I'll never forget. I never saw it coming. I really thought Lee was different, like the real thing. I met her about 5 months ago, and from the moment we started talking, it felt right. We clicked in a way that made me think, this is it. We had all the usual stuff, last, chemistry, deep conversations late at night, and we even started talking about the future. It was that easy. It was that perfect. For the first couple of months, I had no reason to question anything. We were getting closer, and every day felt like it was pulling me in deeper. Honestly, I couldn't imagine life without her. Sure, there were a few things that raised minor flags, like how sometimes she'd be glued to her phone, or how she'd get quiet whenever I asked too many questions about her past, but I just brushed it off. I figured it was nothing, or maybe she just wasn't used to being that open with someone. Then one night, out of nowhere, she told me she wanted to talk. You know that feeling when someone says that? Your stomach kind of drops, and 1,000 scenarios start racing through your mind. I thought she might have been feeling distant or maybe needed space. But when she invited me over, I had no idea I was walking into a conversation that would completely flip everything I knew upside down. When I walked into her apartment, there was this weird energy in the air. It wasn't the usual vibe I was used to. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes a little red, like she'd been crying. My heart started to race. I remember asking if she was okay, but she just shook her head and told me she needed to tell me something she hadn't shared before. I sat down next to her, not knowing what to expect. She started talking about her ex. It was all kind of casual at first. She said they'd been in a relationship for a long time, but that they had broken up months ago. I thought that was pretty normal. Lots of people still talk to their exes, right? It wasn't until she went further into the story that I started feeling that pit in my stomach. She told me her ex still regularly texts and calls her. Okay, I mean, that happens. I didn't think too much of it at first, but then she said something that caught me off guard. She said she wasn't interested in getting back with him. I tried to let that go, but she kept going. She said she had kept it from me because she didn't want to make me feel uncomfortable, but the truth was, she had been seeing him while we were dating. She explained it in this way that made it sound like it was no big deal. She assured me that it wasn't anything serious, that she had no romantic feelings toward him anymore, and that she was only seeing him because they had a history and she felt like she owed him that. She swore that it wasn't a problem, that she was still committed to me. But the more she talked, the worse it got. As I pressed her further, trying to understand how she could have kept this from me, she said that her ex still came over to her place sometimes. They'd hang out, catch up, and apparently it was nothing more than a friendship. In that moment, I wasn't sure what to believe. I wanted to believe her. She had this way of looking at me that made it hard to question her. But everything fell off. Why would she hide this from me for so long? It wasn't like it was a minor thing. She had been actively keeping up a relationship with someone she was once in love with while she was with me. The more I processed it, the more my brain started spinning. I kept thinking back to the times when she'd cancel plans or be distracted when we were together. The times when she'd be glued to her phone, but never wanted to show me who she was texting or calling. The weird silences when I asked about her past. And now here it was. She'd been hiding this whole other part of her life from me. I started questioning everything. How much of what we had was real? Was I just a placeholder? Was this whole relationship just something to keep her occupied while she kept that door open with him? I couldn't make sense of it. It felt a punch to the gut, and I didn't know if I should be angry, sad, or just completely numb. She kept trying to reassure me that it wasn't like that. She said she loved me, that she wanted to be with me. But every time she said something like that, it felt like it was just a line she was feeding me. How could I trust anything she said now? How could I trust her words when they didn't match up with her actions? It was a weird kind of betrayal. I didn't just feel like she had lied to me. I felt like she had been living this double life, and I had no idea. Everything about our relationship seemed like a lie in that moment. Was she just playing me the whole time, using me to fill some void? It didn't help that she kept trying to downplay everything. She wasn't being honest about the full extent of her relationship with her ex. I could tell she was leaving things out. I didn't know what to do. My head was spinning. I wanted to leave, but at the same time, I didn't want to give up on her. I didn't want to admit that I had been lied to for months. I didn't want to believe that everything between us was just some messed up game. So, I took a step back. I told her I needed time to think, that I needed space. I didn't know what to say or how to feel. Part of me was still holding on to the hope that maybe things could go back to how they were. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just ignore the fact that she had been hiding something so big from me. The next few days were torture. Every time I thought about it, I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't get the image of her and him out of my head, which she was still seeing him behind my back, which she was lying about everything. The trust had been shattered, and I didn't know how to put it back together. Eventually, I realized there was no going back. I had been given the truth, and now I had to face it. I wasn't sure what would happen with Lee after that, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The reality of the situation was too much to ignore. I wish I had seen it earlier. I wish I hadn't ignored the signs. But now, all I could do was pick up the pieces of what was left and try to figure out how to move on from someone who had never really been as honest as I thought. Hey, Wide Awake Horror listeners. Here's my story. I still don't know what I was thinking when I started dating Nemo. At first, things were great. He was sweet, thoughtful, and the kind of guy who seemed like he would never hurt anyone. And when Valentine's Day came around, I thought I was in for the best surprise. He wasn't the type to buy over-the-top gifts, but he always found ways to show that he cared. That's why when he gave me the little teddy bear, I thought it was the cutest thing ever. It was soft, with a cute little body and a smile that made me feel like he had put in real thought. I wasn't expecting anything big, but it was a nice gesture. He had gotten me a few other things, like some chocolates and a handwritten note, which made me feel all warm inside. Nothing crazy, just simple and sweet. So when he handed me that teddy, I smiled and hugged it close, not thinking much of it. It was just another cute gift. I had no idea that thing would be the start of a nightmare. It wasn't until a few days later that I started noticing something was off. I was sitting in my room, playing with the teddy bear while I was on the phone with a friend. I was just casually holding it in my lap, squeezing it here and there when I happened to glance at its eyes. It looked weird. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Something about the way they shimmered in the light didn't seem normal. It was like the eyes were too glossy, almost too perfect. The more I looked at them, the weirder they seemed. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a cheap toy. But the more I looked, the more I noticed that the eyes didn't quite line up with where they should be. The stitching around them wasn't as neat as the rest of the bear. They seemed deeper. I ran my fingers over them, trying to figure out what was off. That's when I felt it. There was a tiny indentation on the side of the bear's head. It was so subtle, I almost missed it. But once I found it, I couldn't unfeel it. It was too smooth, almost like there was something hidden inside. My stomach dropped. I knew I had to open it up. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut the stitching around the bear's head, barely able to breathe as I worked. When the fabric pulled away, my heart nearly stopped. There, nestled inside the bear's hollowed-out head, was a tiny camera. I froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The camera was small, so small that I had no idea how I hadn't noticed it before. It had a tiny lens, almost like something you'd see in a spy movie. The kind of thing that didn't belong in a teddy bear. My hands shook as I pulled the camera out, staring at it in disbelief. For a second, I thought I was going crazy. Maybe it wasn't a camera. Maybe it was just some kind of weird toy accessory. But no, the small blinking red light on the camera made it clear what it was. It was a recording device, and it had been watching me. It had been hidden in my teddy bear, spying on me in my most private moments. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was how Nemo had given me that bear, how he must have known what was inside it, how he had been watching me. I needed answers. I needed to know if he knew about it or if this was something I had completely misunderstood. I grabbed my phone and called him, my hands trembling as I tried to stay calm. I asked him to come over immediately. I couldn't wait any longer. When he showed up, I was already holding the camera in my hands, staring at it like it was some kind of alien artifact. My heart was pounding as I showed it to him, barely able to keep my voice steady. I told him I had found the camera and the bear, and he went pale. For a second, I thought he was going to deny it, but then he just stood there, looking confused. He said he didn't know anything about it. He said he had no idea that the teddy bear had a camera in it. He acted like it was all a huge misunderstanding, like he didn't have any part in it. He was just as shocked as I was. I didn't believe him for a second. There was no way he didn't know, no way he hadn't planned this. The camera was too well hidden, and I couldn't believe that he had given me the bear without knowing what it really was. I didn't trust him anymore. I didn't trust anything about him. The thought that he could be watching me, invading my privacy like that, made me sick to my stomach. I didn't know who he was anymore. I tried to reason with myself, but it was clear to me that something wasn't right. No one does something like that by accident. He had been hiding it. Whether he had been using it to spy on me or just didn't care enough to tell me about it, I couldn't be with someone who would do something like that. I couldn't be with someone who didn't respect me enough to keep boundaries. I broke up with him that day. I told him I couldn't be with him anymore, and I didn't want anything to do with him. His face fell, and he tried to explain again, but I couldn't listen to him. I didn't care what he had to say. I couldn't trust him anymore, and the thought of him invading my privacy like that made me want to throw up. I never spoke to him again. He tried to reach out a few times after, but I blocked him on everything. I couldn't be near him. I couldn't let someone like that into my life anymore. That teddy bear, the camera, it was just too much. It showed me exactly who he was, and it wasn't someone I could ever trust again. I still don't know what his intentions were. Whether he was trying to spy on me for some weird reason, or if he thought I wouldn't notice, I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I learned the hard way that sometimes the things we think are gifts can hide the darkest secrets. So I met Say on a dating app a few weeks ago, and things took off pretty fast. We were messaging all the time, and the chemistry was instant. He was charming, funny, the kind of guy who could make you laugh within seconds of meeting him. He seemed perfect, honestly. We'd been talking about meeting up for a while, but he was always super busy, so when we finally set a date, I was excited but also a little nervous. Our first date started off really well. We went to this cute little cafe downtown and talked about everything under the sun. He was easy to talk to, which made me feel comfortable. After a while, he suggested we go for a drive, and I didn't think much of it. It seemed like a nice way to continue our night. He offered to pick me up, which was fine by me because I didn't feel like worrying about parking or anything. When he pulled up to my place, he was already in the car waiting for me. I got in and we took off. Everything was normal for a bit, just casual conversation, music playing in the background, but after a while, I realized we weren't heading toward any of the usual spots. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured he was just showing me something new. But as we turned onto a dark, quiet road, I started to feel a little uneasy. I asked where we were going, and he just smiled and said, "There's a better spot for us to talk." The way he said it was off. His tone was almost too calm. I didn't want to overthink it, but something about the situation felt wrong. The area we drove to was secluded, like the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to run into anyone. It was dark, really dark, and the silence was just unsettling. He parked the car. I remember looking around, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. My gut was telling me I should be nervous, but I pushed the feeling down. Maybe I was just being dramatic. Sam seemed fine, right? But then, when I suggested we head back, his smile faded just a little. He didn't seem upset, but there was a shift in his mood. It was like his energy changed. He started talking about how he'd been looking for someone just like me for a long time. At first, it seemed sweet, like he was trying to make me feel special. But then he kept going on about how we were meant to meet, like he knew me already. The way he said it felt off, like he had more to say, but was holding back. I started to feel that nervous tension again. I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it, but there was something about the way he was talking that felt almost too intense. He said things that didn't make sense to me, like how he knew all about my family and some of my favorite things I'd never mentioned before. My stomach dropped. At this point, I was really starting to panic. I asked if we could go back, but when I tried to reach for the door handle, I realized something. The door was locked. Not just locked like you forget, but locked in a way that made it clear I wasn't supposed to leave. He didn't say anything about it, but the look on his face told me all I needed to know. I was trapped. The rest of the night felt like a blur. He started talking more about how he'd been watching me. He mentioned how we passed each other's paths in different places and that we just hadn't noticed each other yet. I didn't know what to make of that. How could he possibly know that? I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. The whole thing felt wrong, like he was trying to get into my head. I kept trying the door, hoping it would open, but it wouldn't budge. The more I struggled, the more his smile grew. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick bursts. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he unlocked the door and we drove back to my place. I didn't say much on the way back. I was too freaked out to even know how to respond to what just happened. The next day, I decided to look up Sam on social media. I had a bad feeling that I couldn't ignore. When I found his profile, I went straight to his pictures. It looked normal at first, but then something caught my eye. There were pictures of places I had been, places I never told him about. One of the pictures was from a park I'd gone to a few days ago, another from a cafe I went to with a friend weeks before we even met. He'd been there too, but the real kicker: the dates on those photos matched up with the exact days I was there. I didn't know what to think. I clicked through more of his photos, my hands shaking. It wasn't just that he had been to the place I went. It was the fact that he had been there at the same time. But I never saw him, and there were pictures of me in some of them too. Not like he'd been taking photos of me directly, but in the background, caught in the distance, like he'd been following me around. The more I looked, the more I realized just how much he'd been watching me. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could he have known so much about me? How did he know where I'd been when I'd been there? The thought that he had been following me without my knowledge sent chills through me, and the fact that he was acting so calm and confident when he locked me in that car. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I deleted the app and blocked his number. I couldn't even bring myself to tell anyone about it at first. I was too scared they wouldn't believe me. But I had to trust that I wasn't overreacting, that what I had experienced was real. And now, every time I go somewhere new, I can't help but feel like someone is watching me. Like Sam's still out there, tracking my every move. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. I never thought a date could go so wrong, especially when everything seemed so perfect at first. I met Sarah through some mutual friends. She was sweet, a little reserved, but there was something about her I really liked. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking, and she always had this calm vibe around her. For the first few weeks, we spent time getting to know each other, talking on the phone, meeting up for coffee, and all the normal things you do when you're dating someone new. It was all smooth sailing, no red flags. But one night, after a few weeks of dating, she invited me over to her place. I'd been to her apartment before, just for a quick hangout, but nothing serious. This time, though, it was different. She told me to come over for dinner, and I was excited. I was still getting to know her, but it felt like we were really clicking. When I arrived, I was greeted by her usual warm smile. Her apartment looked like something out of a Pinterest board, cozy, clean, and decorated with a lot of plants and soft colors. Nothing seemed off, but there was something that caught my eye right away. At the end of the hallway, there was a door that was always locked. I'm not the type to go snooping around, but the door was strange. It wasn't like a normal door, it looked old, and the lock was one of those heavy-duty ones that gave it a weird, unwelcoming vibe. I don't know what made me ask, but I did. "Hey, what's behind that door?" She looked at me for a second, and her smile kind of faded just for a moment before she quickly brushed it off. "Oh, it's just a closet. It's full of old stuff, nothing interesting." I didn't push it. After all, it wasn't really any of my business. But still, the locked door bothered me. It was odd. I tried to forget about it, but every time I looked at it, it felt like it was staring back at me, daring me to ask more questions. But it wasn't just the door that started to get weird. A few times I was at her place late at night just hanging out, and I'd hear scratching sounds coming from behind that door. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely there. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the noises would always happen when it was dead silent, like someone was trying to get out. I tried not to think about it too much, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was really off. One evening I stayed over. She fell asleep beside me, and as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. I had to know what was behind it. So I got up quietly, trying not to wake her. The apartment was so silent it felt suffocating. I tiptoed down the hallway, and for a second I just stood there staring at that locked door. I knew I shouldn't do it. I knew it was invasive, but my curiosity got the best of me. I reached for the door handle, and to my surprise, it wasn't locked. It opened easily. Inside, I was hit with a cold, musty smell. The room was small but furnished. There was a bed, some old clothes, a few random boxes stacked in the corner. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time, but there was something so unsettling about it. The strangest thing, though, was a picture on the wall. It was an old photo of Sarah, but she looked younger in it, probably from when she was a teenager. There was something eerie about it, like it didn't belong in the room at all. As I walked further into the room, my foot brushed against something on the floor. It was a notebook. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when everything started to feel like a bad dream. The notebook was a journal, and as I flipped through it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a record of every date we had gone on, every single one. The first time we met, our second date, even little things like when I got her flowers for our 2-month anniversary. But the worst part, there were notes about me about us, and the words I read sent a cold wave of terror through me. One of the entries read, "I'm not sure if he'll come back next time. I hope he doesn't find out." It didn't stop there. There were other entries that were just as chilling. She'd written things about my behavior, how I seemed distant at times, how I laughed at her jokes but not quite enough. It was like she was tracking my every move, but in a way that made me feel like I was already being watched. The final entry made my blood run cold. "I just need to make sure he stays. If I can keep him with me, I'll never be alone again." My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the journal. I had no idea what to think. It felt like a twisted version of a love story, one that had gone completely wrong. I dropped the journal and backed out of the room, my mind racing. I had to leave. I couldn't stay there. I tried to calm myself down as I quietly closed the door and snuck back to the living room. Sarah was still asleep, but I didn't feel safe anymore. How could I have missed all the signs? How could I have been so blind? The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced she was following me or maybe already at my door. I had to make sure I never went back there. I didn't care how sweet she seemed at first, how much I liked her. This wasn't just a harmless little secret. This was something way more sinister. The worst part is, I'm still not sure what happened that night. I never confronted her, and I haven't spoken to her since. I don't know if I'm just overthinking things or if she really was hiding something darker. But every time I close my eyes, I see that journal. I see her face and I hear the scratching behind that door. I've tried to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that she's out there somewhere, still watching me. Max was everything I'd ever wanted. Charming, funny, attentive, and so easy to talk to. It felt like we were meant to be. After just a few weeks, we were exclusive, and everything seemed too good to be true. But then, like a slow burn, things started to shift. At first, it was small, barely noticeable things, like how he'd text me constantly, asking what I was doing, who I was with, or where I was going. I told myself it was cute that he just cared. But as time went on, I realized I wasn't just dating Max. I was dating someone who had a disturbing obsession with me, and I didn't even see it coming. It started with little things. He'd text me more than usual. If I was out with friends, I'd get a text asking who I was with and what I was doing. I chalked it up to him just being a caring boyfriend. He would also show up unannounced at my workplace, bringing coffee or just to check in. It wasn't bad at first, kind of sweet even. I wasn't the type of person to think of it as an issue. After all, he liked me, right? But after a while, it became constant. I'd be sitting at my desk at work, trying to focus on a project, and my phone would buzz. "What are you doing right now? Where are you? Who are you with?" At first, I thought it was cute. He was just checking in, being thoughtful, right? But soon enough, it didn't feel cute anymore. It felt suffocating. It was like I couldn't go anywhere without him tracking me. I'd go to the grocery store, and my phone would light up with texts asking where I was, who I was with, I was okay. Even when I was just hanging out with my friends, he would message me every hour just to check in. There was this one night that really made my stomach turn, though. I had left my phone charging in the living room while I cooked dinner. When I went back to grab it, I saw Max sitting on the couch with my phone in his hands. He was swiping through my messages, scrolling through my social media. I froze for a second. He looked up, caught me staring, and smiled like nothing was wrong. At first, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to accuse him of something that might not be true. But something felt off. Why was he going through my phone? He said something like, "Just checking to make sure everything's okay. I know you got a lot of people in your life." Just wanted to make sure there was no drama or anything. It was weird. Too weird. And the way he said it made it sound like he was making an excuse and not giving an explanation. I tried to let it slide, told myself it was no big deal. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I got. I started paying closer attention to how much he knew about me. He would talk about things from my past, details I never told him. I didn't even mention certain relationships, but somehow he knew about them. It was like he'd done his homework on me before we'd even gotten serious. Every time I mentioned something small, he'd reference it later, like he had a running list of everything I'd ever said. It was like he was obsessed with knowing everything about me. The turning point came one day when I was scrolling through social media and I noticed something strange. There was a message on one of my old photos from a few weeks ago, an old acquaintance I had mentioned a couple of times in passing. I thought, okay, whatever, maybe it's just a coincidence. But then I started looking back at other posts, and it was the same thing. Max had commented on some of my old posts and photos, liking things that he couldn't have seen unless he was going through my social media and digging up my past posts. I wasn't sure what to think at first. It was like he was trying to dig into every part of my life, leaving little traces here and there. The worst part, it was all so subtle that I never noticed it building up until it was already too late. It wasn't just the phone thing. It wasn't just the messages or the comments. It was everything combined. He was controlling in a way that was almost invisible, but still powerful enough to make me feel trapped. Things got worse over the next few weeks. Every time I tried to have space, like when I hung out with friends or went out for a solo activity, he would show up. Not in a cute, romantic way. He'd be there at my work, standing in the corner of the coffee shop where I met my friend, texting me every few minutes to make sure I was still where I said I'd be. It wasn't just checking in anymore. It was like he was monitoring me, making sure I was where I was supposed to be, with who I said I'd be with. I started feeling paranoid. I started questioning every little thing I did. Was I being crazy? Or was he really controlling me in the most messed up way possible? I tried to have conversations with him, but he'd always turn it around, saying I was being insecure or making a bigger deal than it was. I didn't want to push him away, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The final straw came when I found out he'd been following me, literally following me. One afternoon, I was on my way to grab coffee after work, and I caught a glimpse of him across the street, hiding behind a tree watching me. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew it wasn't. He had been watching me for days without saying anything. I confronted him about it, but he just laughed it off, as if it was no big deal. That was the moment I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to leave. I didn't feel safe with him anymore. I started distancing myself, which led to even more controlling behavior from him. Texts, calls, trying to show up wherever I was. It was like I had to break free from this invisible cage he had built around me. Eventually, I had to block him everywhere, change my routines, and even move to a different part of town. I didn't want to, but it felt like the only way to get out. I haven't heard from him in months. The worst part is knowing I missed the signs, the constant texts, the social media digging, the little surveillance tactics he used. I thought I knew him. I thought he was perfect. But now I wonder if he ever was. I thought I was in a perfect relationship. I met Sarah a few months ago, and from the start, things seemed to click. She was fun, easygoing, and seemed like she had it all together. Every date was a blast, and we shared laughs, stories, and even some deep conversations. But then things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, small details that seemed like nothing. She would never talk about her family or past relationships. It wasn't like she was avoiding the topic entirely, but any time I tried to ask, she changed the subject, distract me, or give me vague answers. I told myself it was fine. Everyone has a past, right? But it started to bug me. I mean, how can someone be so secretive? It wasn't even like I was pushing her for deep, personal stuff. I just wanted to get to know her better. Over time, I noticed she would get really jumpy whenever I'd bring up anything about her exes. It wasn't just avoiding the conversation. It was almost like she'd become tense, like I was stepping on a landmine. One evening, I went over to her apartment to hang out. She was working from home, sitting at her desk, so I figured I'd just mess around on my phone while she finished up. I glanced over at her desk, and that's when I noticed it. There was a folder sticking out from under a pile of papers. It was partially open, and I could see what looked like a bunch of official documents inside. Curiosity got the best of me, so I picked it up. As I flipped through the pages, I froze. It was a mix of police reports and court documents, none of which made sense to me at first. But as I skimmed over the pages, one thing stood out. There was a restraining order. I kept reading, each word sinking my stomach further. The details were chilling. Someone had been stalking her, following her everywhere, calling her constantly. There were even mentions of threats. I wasn't sure what to do with the information I just stumbled upon. I hadn't even realized she was in danger before. My mind raced as I tried to put the pieces together. Why hadn't she ever told me about this? We talked about so many things, but this never came up. I never felt like I was in the dark before, but this made me feel like I had no idea who Sarah really was. When she finally finished her work, I waited for her to come over to the couch. I had to ask. I needed to know what this all meant. I started to ask casually about the folder, trying not to make her feel like I was digging too deep. But she snapped at me, her voice sharp and defensive. It wasn't like her at all. I immediately regretted even bringing it up. She told me it was nothing, just some old paperwork, but her tone told me something else. I pressed a bit more, my curiosity getting the best of me. That's when her guard finally came down, and she gave me the full story. She explained that her ex had become obsessed with her after they broke up. He started following her around, showing up unannounced at her work, and calling her at all hours of the day and night. It started small, just some weird messages, but it escalated quickly. She told me she had to get a restraining order against him because he wouldn't leave her alone. He even broken into her apartment once while she was gone, just to sit in her space. I tried to understand. Of course I did. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have someone that fixated on you. But something didn't sit right with me. Why had she never told me any of this? Why keep it hidden for so long? Was it because she was ashamed or embarrassed? Or was it something else? The more I thought about it, the more questions kept piling up. Was she telling me everything? Was she being honest with me now? Or was there more to the story that she wasn't ready to share? And even worse, was I just the next target in this messed up cycle? I couldn't help but wonder if this obsession with her ex had been a one-time thing or if she was still in contact with him in some way. Maybe she wasn't as over it as she claimed. The thought of her ex still lingering around in her life made me uneasy. Was he still trying to creep back in? We sat in silence for a while, and I could see the guilt in her eyes. She apologized, saying she should have told me sooner, but it didn't change the fact that I'd found out on my own, and it didn't change the feeling of betrayal that had started to creep in. I couldn't help but wonder how much of our relationship was built on a lie. She kept this massive part of her life hidden from me, and I wasn't sure what that meant for us. In the days that followed, I tried to push the thoughts to the back of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I saw Sarah, the questions kept swirling around in my head. How much did I really know about her? Was I just the next guy in line, the next victim of some weird, unending cycle of obsession? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Sarah wasn't just hiding her past, she was hiding me from it. I started to wonder if she'd ever been fully honest with me, if I was just the safe guy she'd settled for while her ex was still lurking in the shadows. It felt like I'd been caught in a game I didn't even know was being played. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sarah's story than she was letting on. Maybe she was telling the truth about the restraining order and her ex, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. Was I just the next guy in her life? Another chapter in a story that was far from over. In the end, I couldn't shake the unease. It was impossible to trust completely after everything I discovered. And no matter how much I cared about Sarah, there were too many unanswered questions. The whole thing had me questioning whether I could ever really know who she was, or if she even knew who she was anymore. I should have seen the signs earlier, but I didn't. Sometimes when you're caught up in the good stuff of a relationship, it's easy to ignore the weird things that start popping up. Lisa and I had been together for 6 months when it all started getting strange. It was like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. It started with the phone calls. They were always silent. Late at night. The first time it happened, I thought it was a wrong number. The second time, I figured it was just some weird glitch or a telemarketer, but after a week or so, it started happening more frequently. No one ever spoke, just the sound of heavy breathing or complete silence on the other end. It was unsettling, but I didn't really think much of it at first. One night, after the third call in a row, I turned to Lisa. She'd been asleep when the phone rang, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I asked her if she knew who might be calling me so late at night. Her face twisted a little like I asked a question I wasn't supposed to. She shrugged it off, saying it was just one of her old friends trying to get back in touch. Nothing to worry about. I didn't press her, at least not right away. But the calls kept coming, and each time, it was like this little knot was forming in my stomach. It wasn't until one afternoon when I noticed a missed call on her phone, one that didn't belong to any of her contacts, that I started to get serious about it. The number wasn't familiar at all, and it didn't show up in her call history. My curiosity got the best of me, and I asked her about it. Her reaction was off. She got defensive, her voice sharp, like I had somehow crossed a line. She told me it was nothing, just some old guy friend of hers who'd been trying to reach out. She brushed it off so fast, I almost let it go, but something about the way she was acting, like she didn't want to talk about it at all, felt wrong. That's when I made the decision to look at her phone when she wasn't around. I wasn't proud of it, but at that point, I felt like I had no choice. I had to know what was going on. When I unlocked her phone, I didn't expect to find what I did. There were messages. A lot of messages, and they weren't from just any friend. They were from someone named David. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence, but as I scrolled through, I realized it was much more than that. The messages were personal, like they shared years of history. They talked about things I hadn't even known about, places they had visited together, inside jokes, and even memories of trips they had taken. It wasn't the kind of conversation you have with a casual friend. This was the type of stuff you share with someone you're in a deep relationship with, someone you can't just forget about. I couldn't stop reading. There was more, lots more, of them reminiscing about old times. And David even hinted that he missed her. The messages weren't just friendly check-ins. They were full of longing, and it became clear to me that this wasn't some harmless friend that Lisa had claimed he was. This guy, David, was still very much in the picture, and he wasn't over her. The more I read, the more I realized just how much Lisa had been hiding. She had never told me about David, not once. She had kept him around, pretending like their relationship was over, but the reality was, it was far from it. This wasn't just about old memories. It was about unfinished business. David wasn't just calling to reconnect. He wanted her back, and Lisa hadn't fully cut him off. I couldn't help but feel betrayed. Lisa and I had built something real, or at least I thought we had. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was stuck in the middle of something I didn't belong in. There I was, falling for her, while this guy had never truly left her life. He had been there the whole time, lurking in the background, and I had no idea. I decided I couldn't just leave it there. I needed answers, so I confronted her about it. I didn't know what to expect, but I was done with the secrets. I needed to know why she kept David around when she had me. When I asked her about David, she went completely cold. She started saying things like how it was all in the past and how she'd moved on from him. She claimed that David was just someone who hadn't let go of their relationship, but she made it sound like it wasn't a big deal. Her words were rehearsed, like she had said them over and over before. But it didn't feel real. It felt like a cover-up. She had never mentioned David before, not even once, in the entire 6 months we'd been together. It felt like she'd been hiding him, like he was a shadow she didn't want me to see. As I stood there, watching her try to convince me that everything was fine, I realized that the truth was probably much messier than she was letting on. Lisa wasn't over David, not by a long shot. And the worst part was, she had been lying to me the whole time. It wasn't just about one phone call or one missed text. It was about an entire relationship she had kept hidden, all while I thought we were building something real. The more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. Was I just a placeholder for her while she figured things out with David? Was I just the next guy in line, not even knowing that she was still emotionally attached to someone else? I don't know what happened after that conversation. Lisa apologized, of course, but it didn't feel genuine. I didn't trust her anymore. I couldn't. The phone calls stopped for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been living in a lie. I kept wondering how much more I didn't know, how much of our relationship had been built on secrets. In the end, I walked away. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I still don't know what's going on with her and David, but I'm sure of one thing. I wasn't the only one in her life. I swear it didn't feel weird at first. When I met Jason, he was charming, sweet, and honestly, just seemed really interested in me. We met through a mutual friend and started talking over text. For the first few weeks, it felt normal, like getting to know someone new. He'd ask about my day, about my work, and he genuinely seemed to care. He'd listen to every little detail and remember them. "How was that meeting you mentioned?" He'd ask, and I'd be shocked that he even remembered. Small things like asking how my mom was doing after her surgery or if I'd seen my cousin Rachel recently. It was endearing, if I'm being honest. But the more time went on, the more it felt off. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone has their quirks, right? He just seemed to really care. He was probably one of those guys who really wanted to make a connection and be close. But I started noticing that his questions weren't exactly normal. It didn't sound like he was just getting to know me. It felt like he was trying to dig deeper in a way that wasn't necessary. It wasn't like we were talking about my childhood or anything, at least not at first. But then one day, I mentioned a trip I took a few years ago with my family to the beach. It was nothing special. We were just talking about vacations, and it slipped out. And that's when it got weird. Jason went silent for a moment. He didn't respond, just kind of stared at me. After a long pause, he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that beach trip. That was the one where you almost drowned, right?" My mouth went dry. I didn't tell him about nearly drowning on that trip. In fact, I don't think I ever told anyone that. It was one of those things I kept to myself, one of those memories I only shared with my parents and close friends. And even then, I didn't really talk about it much. So, how the hell did he know? I figured it was some weird coincidence. Maybe he knew someone who was there or heard it from a friend. But as time went on, it wasn't just that one memory. He kept bringing up things I hadn't told him, details about my life that he had no reason to know. Like when I casually mentioned that my mom and I used to make pancakes every Sunday morning before she passed away. He didn't just nod and say, "That's nice." Instead, he said, "Yeah, I remember you mentioning how much you miss that tradition." It started to feel like Jason wasn't just remembering the things I'd told him, he was collecting them. Every little fact about my life, my family, my childhood. It was like he had a mental list of everything I'd ever shared with him. But it wasn't even the kind of stuff I thought was important. It was the little insignificant things, the details no one else would care about. That's what really freaked me out. He didn't just ask about my family. He knew specifics about my cousins, about the dog I had growing up, about the way I used to hate swimming as a kid because I had a bad experience with a lifeguard. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I started to pull away, not answering his messages as quickly, trying to keep a little distance. I was starting to feel suffocated. He wasn't just texting me, "Hey, how was your day?" anymore. He was asking things like, "What are you wearing right now?" and "What's your plan for the evening?" I never told him any of these details, so why did he need to know? One evening, I was at my apartment watching a movie alone. It was late, maybe 9 or 10 p.m., and I got a text from Jason. It was a simple question, one I'd gotten before, but this time it didn't sit right with me. "Where are you?" it said. I hadn't told him I was staying in that night. It was weird, but I decided to ignore it. Then maybe 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "You're at home, right? I saw you through the window." My heart dropped. I didn't even know what to say. How could he know where I was? My curtains were pulled tight. My windows were shut. There was no way he could have seen me. I quickly texted back, "What the hell? Who is this?" But the number didn't respond. Instead, Jason's name popped up on my screen. It felt like a punch to the stomach. I didn't even know how to respond to him anymore. The next morning, I asked him about the text. He acted casual, like it was nothing. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I saw you sitting there by yourself and just wanted to make sure everything was fine." The more he talked, the worse it sounded. He knew what I was wearing, what I was doing, even the damn movie I was watching. He said it was nothing creepy, just checking in, but I didn't buy it. Something inside me screamed that this wasn't normal. I started digging. I went through my social media accounts, checking who had been liking my posts, who had commented on my pictures. And there it was. Jason's profile, liking every post I'd made for the past 2 years, stuff I'd posted before we even met. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just really interested in me. But then I realized he was going back, way back, looking at photos from vacations, old family gatherings, places I'd been to years ago. How did he know about that stuff? How did he even find those posts? I tried to confront him about it, but he just brushed it off, saying he'd seen me online before. He tried to play it down, made it sound innocent, but I could see through the act. I started asking myself what he really knew about me. What had he seen? What had he been paying attention to when I wasn't looking? I finally told him I needed space. I didn't want to keep seeing him, not after everything that had happened. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the texts or the random facts he knew about me. It was the way he made me feel like I had no privacy anymore. Like everything I did was being observed, even when I didn't know it. He tried to convince me to stay. He told me he was just looking out for me, that he cared. But the more he said that, the more I realized I was just another object to him. Something he could control. I had to block his number. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I didn't even feel safe anymore. I hadn't seen him since. I've changed my routines, my social media privacy settings, and I even moved to a different part of town. But the worst part, I still get that feeling sometimes, that someone's watching me, just waiting for me to slip up. I don't know if Jason's still around, or if it's just paranoia, but I'll never forget how he made me feel like I was never really alone. I didn't think much of it at first. When I met Sam, he seemed like the perfect guy. Funny, caring, and a little awkward, but in that way that made you want to smile when he tried to crack a joke. We started talking casually through mutual friends, and after a few weeks, we were inseparable. At least I thought we were. I'm not someone who has a lot of serious relationships, so when Sam came along, I was kind of all in. We spent almost every day together: dinner, movies, walks in the park, just the two of us. It felt like we were building something really solid, but looking back, I realized I was probably way too wrapped up in it all. In the beginning, Sam was sweet. He always made me feel like I was the most important thing in the world. He'd text me every morning and every night, check in with me throughout the day. And I didn't mind. I thought it was nice, honestly. Maybe it was just his way of showing affection. He wanted to spend time with me, and I liked that. But over time, it started to feel heavy. It started with little things. I'd go out with my friends, and Sam would text me every 20 minutes, asking what I was doing, where I was, and who I was with. I thought it was cute at first, maybe a little protective. But the questions never stopped. Who's that guy you're with? Are you sure you're not drinking too much? What time are you coming home? At first, it didn't make me uncomfortable. I just assumed he was being thoughtful, concerned, whatever. But as the weeks turned into months, it started to feel like a pattern I couldn't escape. I started losing track of when I last hung out with friends without him. It wasn't like I was actively excluding him, but there was a point when I realized I hadn't seen my best friend Sarah in weeks. When I asked her if she wanted to hang out, she told me that she was getting weird vibes from Sam, like he'd been messaging her too, asking questions about me, making sure I was okay. I didn't really know what to say to that. I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe she was just overreacting, or maybe Sam was just trying to get to know the people in my life. After all, that's normal, right? But the messages kept coming. It wasn't just me anymore. My sister told me Sam had started calling her more often, asking about how I was doing, if I was acting weird, if I seemed stressed. And it started getting even weirder. He started showing up at places I went without telling him. Like when I went to the gym one day, I saw him sitting in the parking lot just waiting. I tried to act like I didn't see him, but when I got home, I found a text from him saying, "Hope your workout went well. I saw you were running a little late." It wasn't like he was just nearby. He'd been waiting, watching. That's when I started feeling trapped. But the worst part, he didn't even seem to care. When I brought it up to him, asking why he was showing up where I was without telling me, he acted like it was no big deal. "I just wanted to surprise you," he said. "I wanted to be close to you." The problem was, he'd been showing up everywhere. Not just the gym, but the library, the coffee shop I liked, even my work. And it wasn't a coincidence. He knew my schedule, what time I usually got off work, where I went after. I tried to make excuses for him, thinking it was maybe a one-off thing or that I was overreacting. But the truth was, I was starting to feel like I had no control anymore. I felt suffocated. Every time I made plans with anyone, it felt like Sam had to be a part of them. If I went out with friends, he'd show up unexpectedly, like it was some sort of family outing. And the texts, constantly, all day, every day. "What time will you be home? Where are you? Who are you with?" It felt like I had no room to breathe. It wasn't just love anymore. It was control. He was controlling every aspect of my life, and I was too afraid to do anything about it. Every time I tried to pull back, he'd guilt-trip me into spending more time with him. "You said you wanted to be with me," he'd say. "We're building something together." But I realized something was seriously wrong when I started getting messages from people I hadn't spoken to in a while. Friends of friends, acquaintances I hadn't seen in years, all sending me texts that made my stomach drop. Hey, I didn't know you were dating Sam. How's he been? He told me a lot about you. Hey, I ran into Sam at the grocery store today. He said you were having a rough week. Are you okay? It wasn't just one or two people, it was everyone. Sam had been telling people things about me. Personal stuff, details about my life I hadn't shared with anyone. He'd been talking to people I knew, even strangers, acting like we were some perfect couple. And it wasn't just the, oh, I saw your girlfriend today kind of talk. He was telling them everything, things that should have stayed private. He made them all believe we were this perfect, inseparable couple. The final straw came one night when I was sitting at my apartment, and I saw him standing across the street, staring up at my window. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but the idea that he was just watching me made my skin crawl. I had enough. I finally told him I needed a break. I needed space to think, to figure out my own life. I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that I couldn't breathe in this relationship. He didn't take it well. He begged me to stay, to reconsider, and said everything I wanted to hear. He promised things would be different, but I couldn't keep living like that. I was afraid. I ended it. I moved away from the apartment, changed my number, and stopped talking to him. But even now, months later, sometimes I'll get a text from a random number or a strange email. There are days when I'm convinced he's still out there, keeping tabs on me, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I haven't seen him since I left, but I still get the sense that he's out there somewhere, lurking just out of sight. I don't even know what his endgame was, whether it was love or control or something else entirely, but I'll never forget how suffocating it all felt. And now I don't trust anyone who's too eager to get too close too quickly. I've always been skeptical about dating apps. You hear all these horror stories about catfishing, people pretending to be someone they're not, or just trying to manipulate you into meeting up so they can mess with your head. But after a while, I decided to give it a shot. I figured, what's the harm in swiping through a few profiles and seeing who's out there? I wasn't looking for anything serious, just some casual conversations, maybe a few dates. Nothing too crazy, right? That's when I matched with Luke. He seemed like a cool guy. His profile picture showed him smiling, sitting at a cafe, looking pretty laid back. He had a decent job, liked hiking and travel, and his sense of humor seemed pretty good based on his bio. We started chatting, and things moved quickly. He was funny, asked me interesting questions, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. After a few days of texting, we decided to meet up. I was a little nervous. Okay, a lot nervous, but I told myself it was just a coffee date. If things didn't click, I could easily leave. No big deal. We met at a local cafe downtown. When I saw him, I was relieved. He actually looked like his photos, tall, with short brown hair, kind eyes. We sat down and started talking, and it felt pretty natural. He didn't seem awkward, and we were laughing about stupid things almost immediately. Everything was going well, so I figured I'd give him the benefit of the doubt. But after about 30 minutes, I started to feel something was off. It was subtle at first, like the way he kept trying to touch my arm or brush against my shoulder when he laughed. I'm not really the touchy-feely type, so I started pulling back a bit. He noticed, and his smile kind of faded for a second. Then he started asking me more personal questions, questions I hadn't even talked about with some of my closest friends. So, how long has it been since you broke up with your ex? What's your biggest insecurity? Do you think you'll ever get married? It was starting to feel more like an interrogation than a casual coffee date. But I didn't want to be rude. I thought maybe I was overthinking things, so I kept answering, trying to steer the conversation in a more relaxed direction. Then, about an hour into the date, something strange happened. He excused himself to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, he acted like nothing had changed. But I noticed a small detail. His phone was now sitting face out on the table, which wasn't something he had done earlier. I didn't mean to snoop, but something caught my eye. His screen lit up with a notification. It was a message from someone named Sophie. It wasn't the name that got to me. It was the message itself. It was a string of texts that started with something like, "Where are you?" and "How's she doing?" It wasn't even a casual message. It seemed urgent. Like Sophie was trying to get information from him. I couldn't stop myself from reading more. One of the texts even said, "You know she's probably not what she says she is. Are you sure you want to meet her?" It wasn't even a question about me personally. It was about me as if I were some sort of project. As if Luke had told this person about me, and now they were watching, monitoring everything. I quickly looked away when he returned, pretending I hadn't seen anything, but my heart was racing. Who the hell was Sophie? And why did it sound like they were strategizing about me? I kept going through the rest of the date, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. After another hour, I decided to make an excuse to leave. I told Luke I had to meet a friend, and he didn't seem to like that at all. His smile dropped again, and he almost seemed disappointed. He said something like, "Oh, I thought we were just getting started. Can I at least walk you to your car?" I didn't want him to, but I agreed, hoping it would make him back off without making things awkward. We stood outside the cafe, and before I knew it, his hand was on my shoulder. I stepped back, trying to keep my distance, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked right at me, and his eyes were a little too intense. "I'll text you later, right?" he asked, his voice a little more serious than before. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. As I walked to my car, I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't look back, but I had this feeling that Luke was watching me leave. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen on his phone. I'd never heard of this Sophie person, but something about her messages made it feel like I wasn't the only one Luke had been meeting through this app. It wasn't just an innocent coffee date anymore. It was like he had a whole operation running. I decided to dig a little deeper. I opened the dating app and went to Luke's profile to see if I could find any clues. That's when I noticed something. His profile picture was gone. It had been there that morning when I checked it, but now it was replaced with a generic photo of a mountain landscape. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think too much of it. Maybe he deleted it for privacy or something. But when I looked through his profile bio, a message stood out, looking for someone real, no games. Something about that felt off. I wasn't the only one in the app, but I was starting to feel like I was being played. I didn't know if Luke had another profile or if he was just using me to get information on other people. I didn't want to find out, and I didn't want to risk meeting anyone else from this app. I ended things with Luke the next morning, telling him I didn't feel a connection and wasn't looking for anything serious. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just said, "All right, no worries. Take care." That was the last I heard from him, but it didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I received a text from an unknown number. It simply read, "Sophie wants to know if you're still seeing him." I never responded. I deleted the number and blocked it immediately, but I still don't know who Sophie is or why she seemed so involved in what was going on. I'm still not sure if I was just a pawn in some sick game, but it freaks me out to think that people out there might be using dating apps for things I can't even understand. I haven't gone back to any dating apps since. I'll stick with meeting people the old-fashioned way, where there's at least some chance of trust. I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd end up meeting anyone worthwhile on a dating app. I was always skeptical about those things, but a friend convinced me to give it a shot. I never expected to actually find someone who seemed to match my vibe, let alone someone as charming as Alex. He was funny, sweet, and seemed super into me. After a few days of texting, we set up a date. I remember being excited when I got dressed that evening, and I was genuinely looking forward to it. We met at this little downtown restaurant, cozy and dimly lit, the kind of place where the conversation flows easily. He was just as cute as his pictures, and his smile had this relaxed, confident energy. We talked about everything: books, movies, stupid high school stories, travel. The night flew by, and I found myself enjoying it more than I had anticipated. Over the next few weeks, we went on more dates, and everything seemed perfect. Alex always seemed so invested in our conversations, and he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. We talked for hours, and it didn't feel forced at all. But the more I saw him, the more I started to notice small things that gave me this weird feeling. The first thing that stood out was how much he just happened to know. Like, I didn't tell him much about my daily routine. Nothing specific anyway. But he always seemed to know where I was or what I was doing. The first time it happened, I was out with a friend at this little coffee shop I loved. We were chatting when I got a text from Alex, asking if I was at the coffee shop near the park. I was a little taken aback because I hadn't told him that was where I was going. Maybe he'd driven by, or maybe it was a coincidence. I didn't think too much of it at first. But it didn't stop there. The next week, I mentioned to him that I was going to run some errands, nothing too specific. Later, he sent me a message. "Are you at that thrift store on 5th Street? I thought I saw you walk in." At this point, I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. How did he know that? I hadn't even told him the name of the store. The thing is, he didn't seem creepy about it. He wasn't following me around or making it obvious that he was keeping tabs on me. It was more like this quiet, unsettling awareness of where I was at all times. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, so I let it go. But the moments kept adding up and it started to feel weird. Then one night, I decided to go out with my friends to a club. We weren't doing anything special, just dancing and having a good time. When I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I felt my phone buzz. I checked it, and it was a message from Alex. "You're at that club, right?" I just passed by with a friend. I hadn't told him where I was going, and I didn't remember mentioning anything about a club. It was like he just knew. By this point, I was starting to get a little freaked out. The feeling didn't go away, but I told myself I was probably overreacting. I didn't want to be that person who's paranoid over nothing, so I tried to brush it off. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I couldn't ignore it. It was a few days later when I decided to go on a spontaneous hike. I needed some time away from my phone just to clear my head. I went by myself, no plans to tell anyone where I was going. I thought it would be good for me to just get some space. When I got to the trailhead, I noticed something strange, a car parked near the entrance, one I recognized. It was Alex's car. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, confused. Maybe he was just there by chance, I thought. But when I saw him walking toward me, his smile just a little too wide. I couldn't shake the cold feeling creeping up my spine. "Hey," he said, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "I figured you'd be here. This is one of my favorite trails, too." I didn't know what to say. It felt like too much of a coincidence. How could he know I'd be here? I didn't even tell him I was going to hike that day. He must have been following me, maybe not literally, but enough to keep track of where I was. And then it hit me, this wasn't a coincidence. Not all of it. A few days later, I went to use my phone, and something was off. The screen was cracked in a way I didn't remember. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I dropped it without realizing. But when I started scrolling through my pictures, I froze. There were photos I didn't take. Handed photos of me just walking around my neighborhood, sitting in a cafe. Even one of me when I was at the grocery store. I wasn't sure how to even react. I knew I hadn't taken these photos. My heart started racing. I immediately checked my camera roll to see if I could find any other strange pictures. And that's when I found the ones that really made me lose it. There were photos of me at home. In my living room, sitting by the window, a shot of my front door that had been taken while I wasn't looking. I tried to breathe, tried to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was losing control. I confronted Alex about it, but his response was terrifyingly calm. "I just wanted to get closer to you," he said almost too casually, like it was no big deal. "I wanted to be a part of your life. I thought you'd understand." I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I blocked him, deleted everything, changed my settings, did whatever I could to make sure he couldn't contact me. But it wasn't enough. He found my work email. He found my Facebook. He kept showing up at places I went to, always acting like it was a coincidence. I had to change my phone number. I had to move. And even then, I still worry sometimes if he's still watching. I've been talking to Jamie for a few weeks before we finally decided to meet up. At first, everything seemed perfect. His messages were always full of humor, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. We talked late into the night, texting about random stuff, making plans for when we finally meet. Honestly, I was excited. It felt like the first time in a long time I might actually connect with someone. When the day our date came, I was nervous, but also really looking forward to it. I mean, we had built up so much anticipation. He picked me up in his car, and from the second I got in, something felt off. The silence between us was a little too awkward, a little too thick. We didn't talk much during the drive, which wasn't how I imagined it would go. It wasn't that he was rude, it was just strange, like he wasn't sure what to say. We arrived at the restaurant, and it was this nice place that I'd heard about from friends. The kind of place where the food is fancy, and the atmosphere is all dim lighting and smooth jazz playing in the background. It should have been perfect for a date, but the vibe wasn't there. Jamie barely spoke during dinner. I tried to ask him about his week, his favorite movies, anything to break the silence, but he just gave short answers and nodded along. I wasn't sure if he was just shy or if something was wrong. It was frustrating because I could tell he wasn't engaged. It felt like I was talking to a wall, and I had no idea what was going on in his head. I started second-guessing myself, thinking maybe I was just overthinking the whole thing. But still, something about him felt off. After dinner, he suggested we take a walk in the park. I agreed, mostly because I wasn't ready for the date to end. We walked for a bit, and the silence between us stretched out even more. There was no spark, no connection like I hoped for. I tried to keep the conversation going, but he barely reacted to anything I said. I couldn't help but feel like I was dragging the entire night along, trying to keep it from dying out completely. We ended up walking down a path I didn't recognize. It wasn't part of the usual route people took in the park. The air felt colder, and I started to feel this uncomfortable tension building up. We were walking further into the park, past the streetlights, where it was darker, quieter. It wasn't that I was scared, just uneasy. There was this feeling like we were moving away from everything familiar, and for some reason I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't in control anymore. I asked Janie where we were going, but he didn't answer. He just kept walking, as if he didn't hear me. I tried asking again, but he still didn't respond. That's when I really started to feel like something was wrong. This wasn't the guy I've been talking to for weeks. The guy who had been funny and open and easy to talk to. This was someone else entirely. We came to a spot near the edge of the park, by a row of benches that looked abandoned. I could barely make out the shape of a park ranger's shed in the distance, but there was no one else around. No one to help if something happened. It was just us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At that point, I wanted to turn back. I told him that maybe it was time to head home, and I wasn't feeling well, but he just nodded. He didn't seem disappointed. He didn't try to make excuses or suggest anything else. It was almost like he'd been expecting me to say it. As we turned to leave, I saw him looking at me in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger or annoyance, it was something else. Something cold, and that's when I realized. He was leading me somewhere, not just into the park, but somewhere away from safety, away from any place I could get help. It felt like I was walking into a trap, and I didn't know how to get out. I started to pick up the pace, trying to move faster, but he matched my speed. It wasn't subtle. It was like he was trying to control the rhythm of everything. It felt like he was waiting for me to act first, waiting to see what I would do. I knew I had to get away. I told him again that I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. This time he stopped. In his tracks. "Why do you want to leave so soon?" he asked, his voice low, almost too calm. I felt my chest tighten. There was something about his tone that made me feel like I wasn't going to get the chance to leave. I tried to laugh it off, make a joke about it, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat in the back of my neck. "I just feel off," I said, my voice shaking a little. "I think I should go." He didn't move, not at first. Then finally he smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was something else. Something calculating. "You don't have to leave," he said, stepping closer to me. "I'm just trying to get to know you better." That was it. That was the moment when everything clicked. He wasn't just shy. He wasn't just socially awkward. He was dangerous. He was trying to get me alone, to trap me in a place where no one could help me. I took a deep breath, trying not to let him see how terrified I was. In that moment, everything became clear. I didn't care about the awkwardness of the date anymore. I didn't care about how strange everything had been. I just knew I had to get away. I turned quickly, breaking into a run. I didn't look back. I didn't know if he was following me, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the edge of the park, where the streetlights were brighter and the traffic was louder. Only then did I slow down, trying to catch my breath. It took a while for me to calm down enough to get a taxi. I went home that night, locking every door, checking every window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Jamie. But I didn't hear from him after that night. He didn't text or call, which was a relief, but the damage had been done. Every time I walked through a park now, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there. It didn't matter if it was dark or light out. I couldn't unsee the way he looked at me, that cold, empty smile. It was the last date I ever had with him. I never thought I'd be one of those people who ends up on a weird dating story thread, but here I am. It started out like any other app encounter. I swiped right, he swiped right, and we hit it off instantly. His name was Mike, and he seemed perfect. Funny, good-looking, smart, and he always had a story to tell. We spent hours texting every night, chatting about our lives, our weird hobbies, and our favorite movies. The conversations flowed so easily that it almost felt too good to be true. I was excited for our first date, and honestly, I thought this might be the one. We met at a small local bar in the city, one of those places where the lighting is just dim enough for everyone to look good, and the drinks come with fancy names like Midnight Mule. Mike showed up early, looking way better in person than he did in his photos. Tall, dark hair, a casual but put together vibe. I couldn't help but smile when I saw him waiting at the bar. I grabbed a drink and we chatted for a while, just like our usual texting, only in real life now. But about an hour into the date, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite pinpoint why, but something about Mike's demeanor shifted. At first, it was subtle, like he was a little too into the details of my life, asking questions I hadn't shared with him. He knew about places I liked to go, things I'd mentioned once in passing. It was as if he had been doing his homework on me, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had mentioned things without realizing. Maybe it was a coincidence. After a couple of drinks, we decided to head back to his place. He seemed eager to show him the apartment he'd recently moved into, so I figured why not. I'd already had a good time and I was curious. Mike was charming, and for a while I didn't think there was anything to worry about. When we arrived at his apartment, he led me inside, and it felt off. The place was nice, sure, modern, minimalist, but there was something about it that just didn't sit right with me. It was immaculate. Not a single thing was out of place. I mean, it didn't even look lived in. There were no personal touches, no photos, no clutter, just sleek furniture and a couple of plants here and there. I brushed it off again, thinking maybe he was just a neat freak, but it kept nagging at me. Mike showed me around the apartment, and when we reached the bathroom, I noticed something odd. There was a mirror across from the sink that looked a little too clean, almost unnaturally polished, like it had just been wiped down for a fresh start. I asked Mike about it, and he just laughed and said he'd just put in new glass. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, but something about that mirror unsettled me. After a while, we started to get a little closer, and he was being more touchy-feely than I was comfortable with. I wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy yet, and when I made it clear that I wanted to take things slow, he didn't take it well. His mood shifted again, becoming more intense, almost obsessive. He kept telling me how beautiful I was, how lucky he was to have met someone like me, but it wasn't flattering anymore. It felt suffocating. I excused myself to the bathroom to clear my head, but as I stared at myself in that mirror, something strange happened. The reflection wasn't just my own. It was like I was seeing a shadow behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. My stomach dropped. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to shake it off and quickly left the bathroom, but when I stepped back into the living room, I noticed that Mike had changed. He wasn't the charming guy I'd met earlier. He had this unsettling smile on his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. He was standing by the window now, staring outside as if he was waiting for something. I was starting to feel trapped. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper from the direction of the bathroom. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, louder this time. You're mine now. I froze, the blood drained from my face. My eyes darted to Mike, who was still looking out the window. I didn't know what to do. I needed to leave, but I didn't want to make a scene. I tried to smile, keeping my voice steady. I should get going. It's getting late. Mike turned around, that cold smile still in place. Don't worry, you'll stay here. With me. Forever. I felt the chill shoot up my spine. This was no longer a date. This was something darker, something I wasn't prepared for. I made a beeline for the door, but before I could reach the handle, Mike was right behind me. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Where do you think you're going? He hissed. His grip tightened, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. This was it. I was trapped. I pushed against him, using every ounce of strength I had, and finally managed to break free. I didn't care how rude I was being. I didn't care that I was probably freaking out over nothing. I just needed to get out. I ran out of his apartment and didn't look back. I spent the next few days trying to shake off the feeling that Mike had somehow changed. I blocked him on everything. Phone, social media, you name it. But the weirdness didn't end there. A few days after I left his apartment, I started getting strange texts. Pictures of the bathroom mirror in his apartment, taken from angles I didn't recognize. There was something off about them, like they weren't just pictures of the mirror. They were pictures of me. It was like Mike was still watching me, and what terrified me more was that I hadn't even noticed it until after I'd left. I thought about calling the police, but then I realized that, technically, He hadn't done anything illegal. He hadn't physically harmed me. Still, the unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was always just one step behind me. I've since moved to a different city, changed my number, and started over. But to this day, every time I pass by a bathroom mirror, I can't help but wonder if there's something or someone waiting behind me just out of sight. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest whisper, "You're mine now." I should have known better. I really should have. The whole thing was too perfect, and now I can't stop thinking about how wrong it all went. It started like most things do, innocently enough. I met Ryan on one of those dating apps that's pretty popular now. We clicked immediately. We had a lot in common, same taste in music, books, movies. It was like talking to someone I'd known for years. We chatted back and forth for a couple of weeks, sharing all sorts of stuff about our lives. Eventually, we decided to meet up for dinner at a place I'd never been but had heard good things about. I was excited. He seemed nice, funny, and easygoing. I wasn't expecting fireworks or anything, but I thought, hey, maybe this could be the start of something good. The day of our date, I put some effort into my outfit. Nothing fancy, but just enough to feel cute and confident. Ryan texted me when he was on his way to the restaurant, and I made my way there, feeling a little nervous but mostly excited. When I walked in, I spotted him right away. He was sitting at a booth by the window, waving at me with a big smile. We hugged when I got there. He smelled nice, and he had a warmth about him that made me feel comfortable right away. We started talking and laughing almost immediately, and for the first part of the evening, everything went fine. But as we ate and the conversation flowed, I started to notice small things that were odd. Ryan was the kind of person who seemed to know a little too much about me. I hadn't mentioned my work to him in detail, but somehow he knew exactly where I worked, down to the floor number. He mentioned my favorite childhood movie, even though I was sure I'd never mentioned it. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he'd seen it in my social media profiles or that it was just a coincidence. But the more we talked, the more it seemed like he knew things he shouldn't have known. The strangest part was when he started talking about my friends. I posted a picture on Instagram a few days before of a group of us out at a bar, and he brought it up, asking about this one friend who had been standing next to me in the photo. He described her in detail, what she was wearing, what she was drinking, how she was laughing. And I thought, wait, how could he remember all that? I hadn't posted a caption with the names of anyone in the picture. How did he even know who she was? By this point, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something about the way he was talking made me feel like I was being watched. Like he knew way too much about my life. But I kept smiling and nodding, trying to keep things normal. After dinner, we decided to go for a walk. It wasn't too far from the restaurant, just along a busy street where people were out and about. The night felt nice, but as we walked, Ryan kept talking about these odd, seemingly random things. He mentioned how he'd been following my online posts for months, how he liked all my pictures without even needing to be asked. He told me how he noticed I had been going through a rough time lately because I'd posted about it once or twice. That's when it hit me. It was too much. Too detailed. And all of it was starting to sound like he'd been stalking me without ever telling me. I froze for a second, and he noticed. I could see his eyes light up with this weird excitement as if he had caught me in some sort of trap. I tried to laugh it off, but inside I was panicking. I made an excuse that I needed to go home. I wasn't feeling well, I said. And that's when he said something that made my blood run cold. I've been following you for a while now, he said, his voice low, like he was letting me in on some big secret. I know your habits, where you like to go when you're out, when you're in. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time, for us to finally meet. I've been planning it all out. I didn't know what to say. It felt like the air around me had thickened, and I couldn't breathe. I had to get away. I tried to move faster, to walk ahead of him, but he grabbed my arm gently but firmly. He wasn't violent, but the way he held me made me feel like I had no control over my own body. You don't have to be afraid, he said. I just want to get closer. You'll see. We're meant to be together. I didn't wait for another word. I yanked my arm free and started walking away. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. My feet moved faster than I thought possible, and I didn't look back. I didn't care if I was rude or if I hurt his feelings. I just needed to get away from him. I kept walking, not stopping until I reached a crowded area where people were around, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I quickly found a cab and rushed home, feeling like I was being followed the entire way. The next day, I woke up to several messages from Ryan. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," one of them said. "I just thought you'd like to know that I care about you." He sent me another message with a picture of my front door from the street outside my apartment. He'd been there. He had been watching me. I was completely freaked out. My heart sank. I blocked him on everything immediately and called my friend to tell her everything. But the weirdest part was that when I checked the photo he'd sent, I noticed something even worse. It wasn't just at my door. There was a reflection in the glass. In the reflection, I could just make out a shadowy figure standing there in the dark, staring at the door. And I swear I could see his face, even though it was hard to make out. I don't know how he found my apartment, but I've since moved. Changed my number, my job's contact info, everything. I couldn't take the chance anymore. Every time I go out, I check behind me, and sometimes I think I see him lurking in the distance, but I'll never really know. The worst part, I can't help but wonder, what if I never truly got away? I thought I was just being paranoid. That's what I told myself when I first noticed the strange things happening. But then it got weirder and I couldn't ignore it anymore. It all started with Ryan. Not the same Ryan from the previous story, but another one. I know it's confusing, but trust me, this story is important. This Ryan seemed different at first. He wasn't obsessive, and he wasn't weird. In fact, he was charming, funny, and we had a lot of great conversations over a few weeks. When we finally decided to meet up in person, I was excited, a little nervous, but mostly just hopeful that maybe, just maybe, I could find someone normal for once. We met up at a coffee shop in the city, one of those places with dim lighting, exposed brick walls, and the smell of fresh espresso that hits you the second you walk in. I remember feeling at ease. He was exactly how I remembered him from our texts: warm, charismatic, and easy to talk to. We spent hours there, talking about everything and nothing. We had this natural flow between us that felt almost effortless. After the coffee shop, we decided to go for a walk in the park nearby. Everything was going great. We stopped by a fountain, sat on a bench, and just kept talking. We talked about our past relationships, our favorite music, and even our weirdest childhood memories. It was refreshing. For once, it didn't feel forced. But that's when things started to get weird. As the sun began to set, Ryan suggested we go for a walk toward the quieter part of the park. I thought nothing of it at the time. I was enjoying his company. But soon, I realized we were heading deeper into the park, farther away from the streetlights and the main walkways. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice a little unsure. Ryan turned to me, giving me a warm smile, his eyes twinkling. "Just trust me, it's a nice spot. You'll like it." I didn't want to seem weird, so I agreed. But something inside me told me that I shouldn't be walking down this path. It was too dark, too quiet. I kept looking around, hoping to see other people, but there was no one in sight. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. I felt a slight chill run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. We finally reached a secluded area near the edge of the park. It was all overgrown, and I could barely make out the shape of an old, abandoned shed in the distance. I couldn't help but feel uneasy. There were no other people, just the sounds of the wind and the occasional animal scurrying through the grass. Ryan smiled again. "This is the spot I wanted to show you." I nodded, trying to act normal, but I felt trapped. I wasn't even sure why. It wasn't like Ryan was doing anything overtly strange, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and decided to speak up. "Ryan, I think I'm gonna head back. It's getting late, and I don't really feel comfortable here." For the first time since I'd met him, Ryan's expression changed. His smile faded and his eyes narrowed just slightly. "You don't need to leave yet. I'm not done showing you around." I froze. Something in his tone shifted, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't the same guy I'd been talking to for weeks. This wasn't the easygoing, friendly guy. This was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. I tried to take a step back, but Ryan was already standing in front of me, blocking my way. "I'm not going to let you leave," he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I felt my pulse spike. My heart started racing. My eyes darted around, looking for a way out. I wasn't sure if I should run, if I should scream, or if I should just keep trying to talk my way out of this. I wasn't sure what to do. "Ryan, this isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. "Let me go." But he didn't budge. He just stood there, staring at me with a weird, almost calculating expression. His smile returned, but it wasn't kind anymore. It was cold. I could feel it in my bones. "You should have known better than to follow me here," he said. "I've been waiting for you." That's when everything clicked. I don't know why it took me so long, but the feeling of being watched, the strange way he'd known things about me that he shouldn't have, it all made sense now. I wasn't here because it was a nice spot. I was here because Ryan had planned it. I had been lured here, and I didn't know why. I felt panic rising, but I couldn't let it control me. I wasn't going to be his victim. Not like this. I took a deep breath and made a split-second decision. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I heard Ryan's footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I pushed through the trees, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs burning from the effort. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the park, where I could see the lights of the street and hear the sounds of people talking. I didn't even bother looking behind me. I just kept running. When I reached the main road, I stopped for a second to catch my breath. I fumbled for my phone, called an Uber, and as soon as it arrived, I jumped in without hesitation. Ryan never reached out to me again after that night. I blocked him on everything. But every now and then, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for me, watching me. The scariest part. I don't even know how he found me in the first place. I thought I'd been careful. I don't even know what his real intentions were, but whatever they were, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I never thought I'd end up in this situation. You know how people say you'll get that feeling when something's off. Well, I ignored that gut instinct, probably because I wanted to believe everything was fine. Tyler seemed like the perfect guy. Funny, easy to talk to, and let's be honest, he was good looking. We met on a dating app, and after weeks of texting, I finally agreed to go to his place. Sure, I'd never done the whole first date at someone's apartment thing before, but I had a good feeling about him. I remember the first time I walked into his apartment, I was expecting something a lot fancier. But no, it was pretty chill, an old, cozy space with mismatched furniture, and a view of the city that made the place feel kinda artsy. He made me feel comfortable from the second I walked in, offering me a drink and starting a conversation like we'd been friends for years. I felt relaxed, like I wasn't on a date at all. After a while, we ended up talking about random stuff. Our childhoods, hobbies, and all that boring but necessary getting to know each other conversation. It was going well, or at least I thought it was. I was the one who needed to use the bathroom first. It's always the little things that make you uncomfortable, right? I stepped down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed something strange. There was a framed photo on the shelf in the hallway. I glanced at it, then stopped cold. I knew that place. I'd been there not too long ago. It was a picture of me walking out of my apartment building, a clear, close-up shot of me I had never seen before. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. It was an old picture, but it wasn't one I recognized. The odd thing was that it was the type of photo you'd take when you're standing across the street, trying to get a glimpse of someone without them knowing. It was clear like whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. I immediately told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was some random picture of me that he'd taken by accident. I mean, it had to be, right? But as I stared at it, a sick feeling crawled up my spine. I walked back into the living room, trying to play it cool, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Tyler was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, looking relaxed. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't stop thinking about that photo. How did he have it, and why was it there? I sat down across from him, and my mind kept drifting back to that photo. I couldn't focus on anything he was saying anymore. I tried to act normal and ask some random question to steer the conversation, but it felt forced. The whole room felt off now. That's when I noticed the way Tyler was looking at me, like he knew exactly what I was thinking, like he was waiting for me to ask him about it. The silence between us felt like it was stretching on forever. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I took a deep breath and asked, "Hey, who took that photo of me?" In the hallway. His face froze for a second, and I swear I saw his pupils dilate. I don't know, I didn't catch it before, but his reaction wasn't normal. He laughed, but it was awkward, too forced. He waved his hand dismissively, saying, "Oh, it's nothing. Just a random picture from a few weeks ago." I thought it looked cool, so I framed it. I didn't buy it. There was no way someone could get that close to me without me noticing. I mean, I walked in and out of that building every day, and I never saw anyone standing there. let alone someone who would have taken a photo of me. But what could I say? He seemed so relaxed about it. I didn't want to make things awkward. So I let it slide. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. It kept gnawing at me, tugging at me like a constant whisper in the back of my mind. We decided to go grab some dinner after that, but the entire time I was on edge. We were walking to his car, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was watching me. It didn't help that we kept walking past spots I recognized, places I went to all the time, like that coffee shop on the corner. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the idea that I was being followed. Was it possible he knew my routine where I hung out? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that picture. I kept picturing the way he looked when I asked about it, the way he deflected the question like he was hiding something. I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't even want to stay in his apartment anymore. The next morning, I decided to go back and grab my things. As I walked into his apartment, I felt like I was suffocating. That photo was still there, sitting innocently on the shelf, as though nothing was wrong. But I couldn't get it out of my head. I started pacing around his place, looking at the other items on his shelves. The books, the random trinkets. Everything felt so staged, like he had set everything up for me to see it. It was like I was in a trap. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my things and told him I had to leave. Tyler didn't stop me. He didn't even try to convince me to stay. I grabbed my jacket and headed straight for the door. But as I was walking out, something caught my eye again. It was another photo. This time, it was on the floor, hidden under a pile of magazines. I bent down, hesitating for a moment, and when I picked it up, my heart skipped a beat. It was a photo of me walking out of the coffee shop I always went to. I never told him about that place. It was my spot. I'd gone there for years. No one else knew about it. I turned back to Tyler, my hands shaking. He was standing by the door now, watching me with that same unnerving smile. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked out, not even bothering to look back. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I had made a huge mistake. The texts from Tyler started coming through, more frequent, more persistent. He knew where I lived, he knew where I worked, and he knew more about me than I was comfortable with. A few days later, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from him. It simply said, "I'll see you soon." I never thought my engagement would start like this. I've been dating Tom for almost 2 years, and while things had been pretty great, I always thought he was just a little different. Don't get me wrong, he was sweet, thoughtful, and we had a good connection. But sometimes the little things just didn't add up. He was always broke, living paycheck to paycheck, and while I understood that, it was becoming more of a trend than just a phase. Still, when he proposed to me, I was shocked, but not in the way I expected. We were sitting on the couch, watching Netflix, nothing special. We'd been talking about getting engaged for a while, but I assumed it would be something a little more romantic. I had no idea that the proposal was going to take a turn that would make me second guess everything I thought I knew about him. He handed me a small box. I opened it, and inside was a ring, a gummy ring. I'm not talking about a sweet candy ring, I mean a literal gummy candy ring. The kind you get out of a vending machine for a few cents. I stared at it for a second, thinking maybe I was being pranked. But no, he was looking at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction. The room went quiet and I didn't know what to say. I just kind of blinked and asked, "Is this a joke?" Tom immediately looked a little uncomfortable and explained. He said that he didn't have enough money for a real engagement ring, and it was just something small to symbolize our commitment. Then came the bombshell. He asked if I could buy him a real ring. I froze. Now, I know money can be tight for some people, but buying your own engagement ring, that was a first for me. I had heard of people sharing the cost of things or buying a cheaper ring, but this felt different. It was as if he wasn't even going to try to make it special, like I had to do the work. I didn't know how to process that. I wanted to be excited to say yes, but instead I was confused and honestly a little hurt. Why didn't you want to put in the effort? Was I not worth saving up for? Why was I expected to pay for something that was supposed to be a symbol of our love, not just some transaction? I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. I started asking myself if this was just a small red flag or if it was something bigger. Was Tom really the person I thought he was? The more I looked back at our relationship, the more I realized things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For example, whenever we went out, he'd always order the most expensive thing on the menu, claiming he was treating me, but then would forget his wallet. I didn't mind paying for dinner every now and then, but it became a habit. And whenever I tried to bring it up, he'd just shrug it off and say he'd pay me back later. I never saw that money again. Then there were the times he'd borrow my car because his was in the shop, and I'd have to get up early for work while he'd stay home, telling me he was looking for a job. He never seemed to have any money to spare, but I'd catch him online buying random gadgets or things for himself. I thought I was just being a little paranoid. After all, everyone has their flaws, and I loved him. But now, after that proposal, it felt like the truth was staring me right in the face. It was like he was asking me to take on the burden of the relationship financially. And when I realized that, I couldn't help but wonder if that's all he was really doing with me, using me. I didn't know what to say or how to react. Tom wasn't exactly a bad person, but everything he did seemed to lean toward manipulation. Even the proposal felt like a way to get something from me, like a calculated move. He knew I was a sucker for a good love story, and he was trying to sell me a fantasy. I agreed to the idea of buying the ring, even though it left a bad taste in my mouth. I told myself I was just overreacting, and maybe I could surprise him with a beautiful ring. I even went to a few jewelers, found something within a reasonable price range, and tried to keep it cool. But as I walked around, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. Why should I be doing all of this? Shouldn't you the one making this commitment to me? I started talking to my friends about it, and that's when it hit me how wrong it was. They were all just as shocked as I was, and they said the same thing. If he can't even buy the ring, how is he going to contribute to the life we were supposed to build together? It felt like I was being set up for a future where I was the one making all the sacrifices, and that didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Tom didn't seem to care about the value of a commitment. He didn't understand that an engagement wasn't about the price of the ring, but about the emotional investment and responsibility we were both willing to share. By asking me to buy him a ring, he wasn't showing me love. He was showing me that he didn't understand the real meaning behind it. Eventually, I came to a decision. I returned the ring and told Tom that I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. We'd been together for a while, but I just couldn't keep ignoring the signs. This wasn't what I wanted, and I wasn't going to settle for a relationship where I was constantly the one giving, but never receiving. We broke up shortly after, and looking back, I don't regret it. That proposal, the gummy ring, and the request for me to buy the real one, those weren't just bad signs. They were glaring red flags. It wasn't the proposal I had imagined, and it wasn't the relationship I wanted to build my future on. And honestly, I've never looked back. I can still remember the first time I saw Haroon. It was during our sophomore year at college. He was that guy everyone seemed to know, the kind of person who effortlessly made friends. I was a little quieter, a little shy, but something about him drew me in. He had this energy, this charisma that made everyone want to be around him. At first, I just admired him from a distance, never thinking anything would come of it. But slowly, over time, we started hanging out more, grabbing coffee between classes, studying together, and eventually it just felt natural. He was easy to talk to, funny, and smart, and I found myself falling for him without even realizing it. After graduation, we both decided to stay in the city. Things were good, or so I thought. We found a little apartment together. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Everything seemed perfect. We were young in love and starting our lives as adults, or at least that's what I thought. A year passed, and we got engaged. I figured it was the next step, and Haroon was on board. We had the big wedding, and for a while, I thought we were happy. I mean, things weren't always perfect, but they never are, right? We'd have few arguments, the usual stuff, but we always worked through it, or so I thought. But then things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. Small things like him coming home later than usual, acting distant, or the way he'd sometimes seem distracted when I was talking to him. It wasn't like him at all. We used to talk about everything, share everything, but now it felt like there was this wall between us. I told myself I was just overthinking it, that it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of adjusting to married life was getting to us both. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the weirdest part was how he started acting around other people. I noticed that when we went out, especially around his friends, he was different. Almost like he was playing a role. He'd act more carefree, more playful, and I could tell there was something he wasn't telling me. Then one day I found something. It wasn't like I was snooping, but I went into our shared computer to check something, and there it was. A message from someone named Aiden. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have friends, right? But then I read a little more. The messages were friendly at first, talking about weekend plans, but then they started getting personal. I won't get into the details, but it was clear that whatever relationship they had, it wasn't just friendly. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. The things they said to each other weren't the kind of things a married person says to someone who isn't their spouse. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, and I felt sick to my stomach. Was Haroon cheating on me? The thought seemed impossible, but there was no other explanation. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. So I waited. I didn't say anything. I just kept quiet and observed. I needed to know more. It felt like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more things that just didn't add up. Haroon would go out at odd times, telling me he was hanging out with friends or working late. But when I asked about it, he'd always give vague answers. I'd ask him how Aiden was doing, but he changed the subject so quickly that it made me feel even more paranoid. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, and deep down I already knew, but I still didn't know the full picture. The truth finally came out one night when I was going through his things. I didn't want to do it, I swear I didn't, but I was losing my mind. The pieces of the puzzle were all scattered, and I needed them to fit together. That night, I found a hidden folder on his phone. At first, it was just pictures of their conversations, nothing too alarming. But then I found videos of them together, and that's when it all hit me. Haroon wasn't just seeing someone else. He had been lying to me for months, living this double life. The realization hit me hard. I couldn't breathe. My heart was racing, and I felt I was going to pass out. How could this happen? How could I have married someone who had been lying to me from the start? I felt so stupid, so betrayed. It wasn't just that he'd been with someone else. It was that he had been hiding this part of himself from me. He had kept his sexuality a secret, kept this whole side of him buried, and I had no idea. The next day, I confronted him. I don't even remember what I said. I just knew that I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I wanted the truth, and I needed to know everything. Haroon didn't deny it. He didn't apologize either. Instead, he just sat there looking like he'd been waiting for this moment. It was like he had expected me to find out eventually, like he'd been living in this quiet, secret world the entire time we were together. He told me that he had known for a long time that he was gay, but he had tried to bury it. He said that he married me because he thought it was what he was supposed to do. He wanted to please his family, to fit into the mold of what was expected of him. He thought he could keep up the act, but he had always felt torn, like he was living someone else's life. Aiden had been in his life for a long time, and when he realized he couldn't keep hiding anymore, he turned to him for the truth, for the love he'd been missing. I didn't know what to say. I was in shock. It was like the ground had been pulled out from under me and I was falling. I felt humiliated, lost, and heartbroken all at once. I didn't even know who Haroon was anymore. The person I had married was a stranger. In the days that followed, everything came crashing down. Haroon moved out, and I tried to figure out what to do next. There were so many emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, but more than anything, I felt like my whole world had just been turned upside down. I never saw it coming. The man I thought I knew, the man I married, was living a lie the entire time. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was my reality now. And now, all I could do was try to pick up the pieces and figure out who I was without him. The truth had come out, and all I could do was try to move forward, even if it felt like everything I knew had been ripped apart. I can't believe I'm even writing this down, but here we go. I don't know how to explain it, but I guess it's my way of getting out there. This is the story of how my girlfriend Holly broke up with me for my dad. It all started like any other relationship. Holly and I had been dating for about a year and everything was going well. We'd met through some mutual friends, and at first, it was all casual. We hung out, laughed, got to know each other, and before long, we were officially together. We do the usual things: go to the movies, grab lunch, chill at each other's places. And to be honest, I thought things were perfect. I mean, I really liked her, and she seemed to like me just as much. There was just one thing. It wasn't anything huge at first, but I noticed that Holly was always around when my dad was home. And I mean always. I didn't think much of it. My dad is a cool guy. He's a bit older, but he's funny, super laid back, and everyone seems to get along with him. He had been a single parent most of my life, so I guess there was a little part of me that didn't mind him being so involved with my friends or my relationships. But there was this subtle shift that started happening over time. She'd linger around him a little too long when she came over, asking him questions about his work, his hobbies, even his past. Stuff that seemed out of place considering she knew I was there, but she didn't mind. I'd brush it off though. People talk, right? It started to feel a little weird when I'd catch them exchanging those little glances, like just a second longer than necessary. I'm not the most suspicious person, so at first, I thought I was reading too much into it. I figured I was just being paranoid. After all, nothing had actually happened. Still, it nagged at me. Holly would text me constantly, but she'd also text my dad sometimes. At first, I thought, okay, maybe they're just getting along. But when I started seeing her hang out with him more than she'd hang out with me, something inside of me just clicked. Something didn't feel right. One night, I came home early from hanging out with some friends. I wasn't planning on it, I was just bored, so I decided to head back. When I opened the front door, I heard laughter coming from the living room. I assumed it was my dad watching TV. As I walked in, I saw them. Holly and my dad sitting on the couch together, laughing like they were old friends. The moment I walked in, they both froze. Holly quickly stood up and said something about how she'd just been telling my dad a funny story, but I didn't believe her. The way they looked at each other like they had a secret hit me hard. It wasn't just casual, it wasn't just friendly. It felt intimate. My stomach turned, and I just walked up to my room, not saying a word. Over the next few weeks, things started to get even stranger. My dad's presence in my relationship became more pronounced. Holly would constantly text him, sometimes even calling him. At first, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. I kept questioning why she was getting so close to him when we were supposed to be the ones building our future together. She'd always laugh it off, saying things like, "Oh, I'm just talking to your dad about random stuff," or "He's got some great advice." It was the night of my birthday when things reached a breaking point. Holly and I had planned a dinner at a nice restaurant, and I was really excited. But Holly didn't show up. I thought maybe she was running late, but she texted earlier saying she was on her way. So I waited, thinking maybe she was just stuck in traffic. After about an hour, I gave her a call, but it went straight to voicemail. I kept waiting, and after another half hour, I was starting to get concerned. I tried calling again, and this time she picked up. But when I heard her voice, it wasn't the voice I expected. She sounded different. I asked her what happened, why she wasn't there, but she said she was with my dad, helping him with something at the house. I was hurt, confused, and angry all at once. This wasn't the first time she'd canceled plans with me to hang out with him, but this time it was on my birthday. I didn't know how to react, so I just hung up. I went back to my apartment and my head was spinning. The next day, things took a turn I couldn't have predicted. Holly showed up at my place and she told me she needed to talk. I was already on edge, and my anxiety hit its peak when she told me she wasn't happy. She said she'd been thinking a lot about everything, and that it just wasn't working between us. I was crushed. We'd been together for over a year, and I couldn't understand why she was breaking up with me. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said she had fallen for someone else. I wasn't prepared for the shock that followed when she told me it was my dad. I thought I misheard her, my dad. The guy who raised me, the guy who I had looked up to for years. She explained how they'd been talking more and more, how she felt an emotional connection to him that she couldn't deny anymore. I couldn't even process what she was saying. My mind was racing, and I just kept hearing the words over and over. When she told me they had started a relationship, my entire world shattered. I couldn't believe it. I just sat there numb while she packed her things. And that was it. Holly and my dad, together. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. I'm not even sure how I got through the next few days. I avoided my dad, who was doing everything he could to act like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I was lost, broken, and disgusted by what had happened. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. How could they do this to me? How could my dad and the girl I loved both decide to betray me in the worst possible way? The pain of it still hasn't gone away. I don't know if it ever will. And the worst part, I'll never understand why.